Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. Today we are talking about the basis of so much of what goes on in these universes, canon. And on it we have the two granddaddies of the MCUCast, Jeff Randle and Matthew Carroll. And we're going to talk about the good side of canon, the bad, how it can really help to make the experience as a fan so much better, and when the focus on canon can become a little bit toxic or problematic. All that and more after a commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. My name is Matthew. Matt and Jeff, so glad to have you with us. From what I can tell, this is a pretty quiet week in the MCU world, so I'm guessing you should have tons of time, and glad you could come spend a bit of it with us.
Oh yeah, man, just lazing around.
Yeah, I'm just really glad we agreed to do this podcast before we knew we were doing like 6 podcasts this week in the MCU realm.
Yeah.
And live streaming all of them.
It's just, it seemed like a light week at first. We were going to do this good evergreen content.
Yeah. It is nice for me to be doing something not Star Wars for just a minute because both MCU and Star Wars have just had a huge amount of new content announced. But I think it's both relevant to both of those because honestly, part of what got me thinking about this topic was the fact that in both of those universes, as well as some of the others that I hear you all talk about sometimes, but especially here, we are now getting so many shows and so many movies that start to kind of really, even in more detail, fill out the world, fill out the universe. And so many of the questions that I'm already hearing coming up are about how is it all going to fit together in the canon? Like, what's this new thing going to do? How is it going to affect that other thing? Across the board with all of these. So it's a bit of a crazy time to be sure, but it felt like a really important time to talk about this topic. And so I'm just really glad to have you on because I know it's something that's so important to both of you.
Yeah, well, thanks, man. Thanks for having us on. Always a pleasure to be over here at Super Ethics. It's been a while. Actually, it's been a while since I've had any podcast with you, Matthew. And I was thinking about it the other day when you invited us here. I was like, oh, goodness, I'm glad. I've really been meaning to get on another one with you. I have strong feelings about canon.
Yeah.
Oh, we know.
Yeah. And from an ethical perspective, like, to me, ethics is about... I'm a bit of a utilitarian when it comes to ethics. Yep. Ethics is about you do a thing, it has an effect on people. It has an effect, therefore that's why you don't do or do the thing. Like that's to me that's ethics. It's you do things.
Sorry.
You do things, you don't do things. Thank you for making
I'm a child.
Undercutting.
You're a mature gentleman talking about mature ethical philosophical topics.
Yep. That's the source of your why, right? For me, anyway. That's what I believe. And to me, canon is about things having repercussions.
Yeah.
And so, like, there are obvious extremes on either side. If you care so much about a little minute detail that it throws the whole point out for you, like, maybe lighten up. But if you are throwing out past context that is important to the story, like why are you even trying to tell that story in this universe? It's actually a tenet on our strandedpanda.com, like what is a stranded panda, and like one of the things is like we care about canon, we care about having a story that makes sense internally.
And I think that's such a good point, and you're right, it's very ethical because a lot of times when I look at superhero stories or science fiction or whatever, a lot of my question is about those repercussions. Like, okay, we just saw our hero slaughter 50 people and smash all these buildings in this epic fight with the supervillain. But what about the families of all those people? What about rebuilding the city? What about the economic damage, And I think a lot of the shows that, especially like, The Boys, is all about the repercussions and the effects on the world of these superheroes existing. And Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. or Spider-Man are all about, like, what are those effects of things, In Star Wars, we're really getting to dive into some of that. So I think it's a fantastic point.
Yeah, I think with Mandalorian, we're especially getting a hard look, especially in the recent weeks of the show. We're seeing a lot of people that, it doesn't matter if it's Empire or New Republic, it doesn't matter to them. Like, they're still getting shat on, basically, by somebody in charge. And it's that kind of story that is so far from the Luke Skywalkers and the Han Solos and the General Organas of the Star Wars verse, but those are the stories that I'm craving at this point, because like for decades we've seen those big stories and the bombastic tales and, you know, this guy, this legendary dude made the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs, whatever. But like now we're finally seeing what the rest of that universe looks like.
Yeah.
And, you know, my opinion on canon is it depends. Matt takes a very utilitarian stance. I think that it varies based on the item in question. If your overall story doesn't even involve remotely the big story that's already been told, cool, do whatever you want. I'm fine with it. But if your overall story is based on, because like this is the gatekeepy canon. If it's based on an established story or inspired by it, I think you still need to honor the heart of that story or the crux, what that story is about. And maybe more importantly, rather, what the character is about in that moment and what's important to the character. And, you know, with things like The Mandalorian in Star Wars canon, it really isn't that impactful that we've seen. It could become more impactful. But, you know, it kind of depends, because there are things where, like the prequel movies where Lucas screwed up his own canon and was like, none of this should be happening like this based on what Kenobi said. But
yeah,
I guess we'll have to finger wave our way through that. But, you know, according to Lucas, we don't understand the Star Wars franchise.
Lord. There's a whole other element there.
Yep.
Well, and let's actually back up for a second, and let me just simply ask you this: what is canon? Like, it's a very, very broad word. So, what do you think we mean when we say canon?
I mean, in the simplest terms, canon is the established story, and I think that holds true for the established character story, like what the character has gone through, how they became who they are, be it a hero, a villain, whatever. But also, like, I feel like canon is less and less nowadays about events that happened in this sequential order, but more about arcs of character. What do you think, Matt?
Well, I mean, yeah, I think that's it. Just established story. I think that's exactly what canon is. And I mean, people use it to, yeah, that's a great, you did great. I have nothing to add, really.
Man, what happened? I blacked out. Matt just flat agreed with me, everybody. Let's get that on record.
Don't worry, I'll try to find some ways to divide you up.
Okay.
When I was thinking of this question, I mean, canon can be 8 million things, but I kind of divide it into these 3 categories. I'm wondering if you would agree with these or add any more or change them. But to me, canon can be, there's character canon. And that's kind of like the stuff you were talking about. It's, okay, and this is especially true with prequels, but it can be true with going the other direction as well. But if we know that by age 40, this character is at this place in their lives, we need to see that, like, the stuff that we see in their earlier stories fits with, like you just said, that arc that they would be on. Like, it makes sense to help explain how they get to where they are. And that stuff later feels like it is a same arc. You know, it doesn't feel like a total departure. Or if it is, it explains how they got from one place to another.
Yeah. There needs to be a natural, organic flow to it, rather than just like, who the hell is this Solo guy?
The second one is when I think of the story canon. And this is kind of the, like, you know, do the details of the story continue to line up? You know, if at one point in the story we said this person has never met someone else, do we see the two of them meeting in a prequel? You know, or do we see like someone saying like, well, this has never happened before, and we see it happening in a prequel? Like, those kind of that kind of a canon of like, how does the story all fit together? You know, the story of Cap and Bucky. You know, if you did a prequel about Bucky that showed that like they hated each other, that wouldn't fit their story. You know, that kind of storyline up.
Well, and now you touch on something that another way that canon touches ethics to me, that it really lights a fire under me to think about, is that to me, if you are basing a story on a previous story, whether it's a prequel or whatever, or a sequel, or a concurrent story like they did with Saw 4, Spoiler alert.
Talk about deep cut.
Quite literally.
You have a company that is deciding to make this exist in a world. Why do they do that? Because they know they're going to bring in fans.
Right.
And then to break canon, once you have done that, you are choosing to disrespect the thing that brought those people in.
Yeah.
And in many cases, you are using the fan base and using their love for this thing to bring the fans in, and then not respecting what brought them there. And to me, that is unethical from the studio's perspective.
Yeah.
Especially when it's like, if it changes director hands, part of the way through, it's like, oh, cool, I like what you did there, except it sucks. I'm going to do it my way, and then you'll see it'll be really good.
Yeah.
Do you notice the Peter Quill reference there?
Yeah. Like, I think a great example of that is the most recent Star Wars movies, where all three of them, like, different directors, and the story just there is no consistent canon of those three stories, Is Rey from this kind of background or not? Who's the big bad? Those things don't line up. And I think, Matt, what you're getting into is what I was going to call the third category of canon, which is world canon. And this is more about, like, the details of the world. Like, okay, at this point we established that a nuclear war happened in this year. Okay, well then another story that's set in a certain time has to reflect that in some way. It has to take that into account. And I feel like you all talk about what I think of as like a good and a bad example of this. To me, a good example of world canon is the snap, and how, there was this major event that happened in Thanos removing half the population in the MCU. And we have in things like Spider-Man, Far From Home, examples of like, okay, here's how the world is dealing with that. The canon of the world fits those events.
Yeah, the world was affected by this, like, because it couldn't have not been.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And
so,
what I was going to... go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So, like, having Spider-Man Far From Home show that, like, everybody is still dealing with these things. Like, not only is it that people disappeared for a little bit, but, like, one of my favorite parts of Far From Home is that Aunt May herself has a story about when she reappeared in someone else's home, right? It was her home, but it was somebody else's home. And the guy, or the wife of the guy, thought that she was his mistress. And, like, that's a really funny story. And that's something that, like, if I were writing it, being the Luddite that I am, I never would have thought of that kind of thing to add, but that adds so much flavor to the world, in that, like, of course somebody's going to have a goofy story of how they popped back in and be like, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And I love that about that one particular thing, in that they did that world building so damn well.
Mm-hmm, for sure.
Absolutely.
And Matt, especially, I'm curious your thoughts on this. To me, the example of bad world building, of bad world canon, is not all, but some of the newer. I've heard you and especially Dave talk about this. Some of the newer Star Trek canon content, in terms of, like, early on in season 1 of Discovery. I think now they've kind of evened it out somewhat, but there were a lot of feeling like that what was happening in the world with the Klingons just didn't fit the canon we had. Or that, especially with the movies that came out, that it just didn't fit it's established in a universe, but it didn't fit in the same way.
For sure.
One thing I've been noticing is going back and watching the original series, when we think about the joke about what is Star Trek, it's gay space luxury communism, because all the stuff Picard says about how there's no money in this universe, etc. In original series, they absolutely have money, and they're constantly talking about who's going to get paid what and stuff like that.
There's some examples of that. There's a book called The Economics of Star Trek, actually, which is interesting, because it really takes a lot to try to parse it, because, and the truth be told, in the original series, they just didn't know what they were going for yet. Like, the economic system had not been written, and it seems that, like, in the Federation, they don't have money, but when they deal with other cultures, they have money. And they apparently they're given some sort of stipend so that, like, they're able to, deal with other cultures. Similar to, like, DS9, they're on a Bajoran space station, so there's a lot more money changing hands on that show.
For sure, yeah. And I think that's there's another canon issue that we're going to talk about where a later thing in the series establishes an idea and then tries to kind of backdate it, like you're talking about. Because you're right, the same way, like when Lucas wrote the first Star Wars movie, he certainly wasn't thinking about the larger canon that's being explored now and things like that. In the same way with Star Trek. But I'm curious, like, if you would agree that, and sure, there are many others, Star Wars, I think certainly, all the comic ones certainly, but that in the ways I just talked about, maybe not even with the money stuff, like with the Klingons and other parts of Earth's history, that especially more recently, there have been problems with Star Trek breaking that kind of world continuity we're talking about. Not necessarily a character or a story, but just the general sense of like what's been happening with the Federation, what's been happening with the Klingons, what's been happening with this universe for the last 400 years. Some stuff has not lined up as well as it might have.
Yeah, the thing with Discovery, the vast majority of the canon breaks in Discovery are visual. There's very little actual canon breaks in the story, or even with the world building. And some of the ones that were presumed in season 1 of Discovery that people got really mad about, you can find essays online where people are like, no, this is not out of canon. This is in canon because of this episode with there's a lot of things like, for instance, they have like their interfaces they use for technology are way different. Like they have holographic interfaces instead of old view screens that look like Pong, and that could definitely be called a canon break. I am much more forgiving for all the reasons I said up top. About it. It really is about ethics and like what happens in the story. Like if a character does something and then that character's doesn't have repercussions for that, and it doesn't change what goes forward, that bothers me. If they change a ship design, doesn't really bother me, even drastically. It just doesn't really bother me. I don't know. That's my own personal canon thing. Like it just doesn't bother me. My co-host on the Star Trek Universe podcast cares very much if they change the angle of a strut on the Enterprise. He gets very upset because and I get it. And that to me is like, that's his fandom. He grew up drawing that ship. Like he spent hours and hours examining that ship. And I can't say that his is not valid because it's that same thing that goes to that ethics of the companies, like are sort of like, these people love this thing. We're going to use that thing, but change it however we feel like. And that they're kind of using his fandom to get his money when they're not respecting what he loves about Star Trek. And, it just depends on how much they want to blaze a new trail and how much creative control. And I guess this goes to the other side of this. Like we've been very pro canon here. The other side of this argument is how ethical, if we're going to this is superhero ethics after all, how ethical is it to, and we have this problem in Marvel, Star Trek, Marvel, to chain creators to a canon when they want to tell a certain story.
Right.
And as a fan, I would say, just go tell your own story. But that's not really the world we live in. If you want to tell a $100 million space opera, that has never been done.
That's not happening independently anymore. You got to be part of Star Wars or MCU or DC or something like that.
Exactly. So if you want to work on this level with these budgets and with this stuff, this kind of technology, like you kind of have to fit into this world, and that does hamstring some of the stories you're going to tell. But it's sort of a devil's bargain, and I don't know. There's definitely something there to say, like, I want creators to be able to tell the story they want to tell, but I also don't want them to use my fandom to rope me into watching a story that isn't actually tied into the thing that I grew up with or the thing that I love. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. There's definitely two sides to it.
It's unfortunate looking back at Marvel Marvel Television Studios. Because like Perlmutter was such a person when he was in control of things. Whenever everything shifted and Kevin Feige didn't have to report to him anymore, it seemed like all of the TV stuff was no longer related to the movies, and it kind of feels like Ike Perlmutter was doing exactly that, using our love for this fandom to bring us into the TV shows just to get a buck.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and it goes, we're podcasters. We talk about this stuff every week, and we are using our platform to talk about a show called Runaways. And the reason we're doing that is because we love that show. So we say, hey, come listen to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We're all going to invest our time and discussion on this show called Runaways because it's connected to the larger MCU, and that's what we do here. And then all of our friends and listeners are like, is this connected? Because they didn't care at all. They didn't even try to make it connected. And it's like, it's using our fandom to get us there, get us in the door. It's a bait and switch, and it's kind of false advertising.
And I think this all raises also another very significant question, which is, like, in some ways, I think the easiest place to do canon is in books. Because all you really need is one author to create stuff. And as long as any other authors are reading the same things, they can all create stuff. But once you start getting involved actors and directors and budgets and things like this, for me, a great example is the MCU to some extent, or DC Universe or any of them, because on some level, after Avengers, it sort of feels to me like you have to come up with some contrived reasons to explain why every superhero movie going forward isn't an Avengers movie. Because, once Captain America knows he has these things, he has these friends, why doesn't he call Tony Stark or Thor or anyone else to help him deal with the fact that Hydra is taking over S.H.I.E.L.D. or, whatever it is? And the stories always give us these, good reasons why they can't, and sometimes they feel contrived and sometimes they feel they don't. But really it's because, like, Captain America needs his own movie, and Iron Man needs his own movie, and you can't have all them in the same movie because you never get any real character development, and you're paying so much money to all these actors that now popcorn is going to be $30 a bundle. Right. 36, yeah, $30 a tub. So I get the reality of it, but I think that's Matt, you raised a really good kind of can of worms there, is what happens when you have to break canon to some extent because of the just economic and practical realities of trying to make these movies and TV shows.
Sure.
It's really funny that, like, this isn't an Avengers level threat is kind of a really unethical way of saying, like, we need to separate these characters so that we can make, loads of money on different movies. Because, like, in universe, like, why would you not put the Avengers on every big threat that comes up?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't it be better, ethically speaking, if you put the biggest gun in there immediately to just shut down the threat and nobody gets hurt?
Sure. So, like, as someone, like, we're running a podcast empire here, right?
Yeah. Totally.
I like that. I have a fiefdom within your empire, and that.
We're all running this empire here, and trying to make as many cool podcasts and fun things to listen to as we can. And, like, sometimes, I've got to be editing while you got to be doing something else. We can't all three be on every podcast, and that's why so many more people get involved. We all have kind of people we work with otherwise, like. And it all kind of does that. So I get that, like, it not being an Avengers level threat. Sure. Now that changes a little bit.
Are you comparing us to the Avengers?
Like, yeah, that's exactly what I'm doing.
It's not an MCUcast hosts level threat. It's not a big enough show that we have to get involved.
No, I'm not us, not the two of us. I'm saying all of us. Like, all of the pandas are the Avengers, right?
I like the backpedal. You're doing a great job. Keep going.
I didn't. I was talking about all of us from the beginning. There's no backpedaling here.
Audience, remember when I promised I wouldn't have them agreeing with each other all the time? You're welcome.
He promised to drive a wedge, and I worked right into Zemo's hands here.
You really did.
I think it's a number of good points though that you're making, and I do understand the analogy that you're making, and I think it's fitting, and that, and it's funny because I never really put this together until I started thinking about this until the last week or two.
We're the Avengers.
Well, no, not even that part. But clearly I've been Tony for a while. But that's neither here nor there. But no, my point is, for a long time I did not like animated stuff. I didn't really get into it. I didn't think it would be as impactful or as meaningful. And I've come to realize, especially when I watch Star Wars: The Clone Wars, but even more so the Justice League cartoons, and from what I understand, the Marvel cartoon, although I haven't seen that one as much, it's actually a lot easier to do the deep canon in those because, for Justice League, you could always had all the heroes. You could always include them in any story.
Yeah,
Clone Wars, you could include any of the Jedi or some of the Jedi or one of the Jedi or none of the Jedi. And there was never a thought of like, oh, but well, the voice actor playing Anakin and Obi-Wan, they're our big stars. We have to have them in every episode, So yeah, I think that's an interesting, I think in a lot of ways I prefer live action in almost every way, but it is interesting how the animated stuff, just because it's so much easier to get all the voice actors in the same room or, in the same show at least, it makes some of that deep canon of the big team up a lot easier.
For sure. And it also makes it a lot less forgivable when something can't get crossed over, or like when they don't make those things work. Yeah. It's like, why didn't you tie this in? It could so easily happen. Yeah. You literally don't even need the voice actor.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just put them on the screen. Draw a few squiggles and they're there.
Exactly. Howard the Duck is such an easy model to draw. Put him in there.
Yeah. So moving aside from the practical sides of it, what are the benefits you see to having a strong canon? Like why does it mean so much to us? I think the ethical point is definitely one that I very much agree with. What else do we get out of having these strong canons that hold together and that are consistent?
Oh man, you get the Stranded Panda Network. Like we got together because the canon of Marvel was so tight and so well developed and so perfect in especially in its infancy. Right after Guardians of the Galaxy came out, where it was like, now there's a new facet to this canon, and Matt was like, I love it so much, and like called me up. Like you get rabid fans like we are.
Yeah.
If you have that tight continuity where you've told this established story and you follow your own rules.
Absolutely. And that's exactly it. Getting just like completely, lost in this stuff. And this has nothing to do with ethics. It's everything about just how my brain works. But something I realized when I was going through therapy a couple years ago, and like just trying to learn who I was, doing some of that excavation work to figure out who I was. Right. And I realized so many of my issues, like so many of the things that I have problems with in this world, are when things don't follow their own rules or things aren't internally consistent. And I just realized that's a part of my brain. It's just part of who I am. And it's like a big part of who I am, not just in this, but also in like all kinds of other ways in my life and my belief systems. And so like I'm always building sort of belief systems around things to make them internally consistent. And it's just the way I work. And so like I don't know, it's not a good or a bad. It's just the way I work. And so they get my money, I guess is what I'm saying. But like they draw in people like me who are, I guess, all broken in the same way, that we need this kind of content to work. We need it to be logically consistent. I don't know. There definitely was a time in storytelling where stories did not have to be logically consistent. You could tell one story one way, in the next Jason movie, he doesn't have to have the same origin story or whatever. Like they could jump around. But at some point, with all the knowledge out there, we just had this expectation. And I do think something like Star Trek is an early example of it. Well, that's probably not even true. I mean, Lord of the Rings, I'm sure there's some canon breaks somewhere in there, but he was real careful with that stuff, So I don't know.
You want to talk about a freaking world builder, like Tolkien and his continuity, like the whole of Middle Earth, like you don't even know.
Oh yeah, I don't even know. That's true.
I think that also brings up a very good point, which is, I think one of the ways in which canon has become such a big issue is that we now have these multiple universes, which have had, over the course of time, multiple creators.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to say that something that Tolkien wrote doesn't fit the canon because he wrote it. He wrote all of it, and it's all his canon. And we can say that maybe like he lost the thread somewhat. Certainly Lucas did with Star Wars, but it feels like a lot of where this canon stuff comes in, and we've had this from comic books long before any of the stuff we're talking about now, but is where you're now on the 5th or 6th or 7th writer and another new director. And that question comes up about how well are they honing to the spirit of all this and to the details and to the characters.
Right.
Matt, it's funny. And we're going to talk about problems with Canon. And I think the need for consistency is both a positive and a negative, to be sure. But I mean, just this week, I have been really wrestling with this because one of the things that we heard in the new Star Wars stuff coming out is that we're going to get a Kenobi show. I'm super excited about it. And that part of it is going to feature, Hayden Christensen back playing Darth Vader, and that they're going to have some kind of confrontation. Kathleen Kennedy referred to it as like, the rematch of the century that we've all been waiting for. I'll put my hand up as someone who has not been waiting for that.
Who's waiting for it?
Well, here's the thing, and it's when you realize it's dumb because maybe it comes from one or two sentences. But in A New Hope, the first of the Star Wars movies ever made, when Obi-Wan and Darth Vader confront each other, we get told like this is their first meeting after so long, and certainly the strong implication seems to be since their last fight that when Anakin became Darth Vader. And for me, and some other people on our network have suggested ways you can kind of look at a particular line from a particular point of view, which is a very Star Wars thing to do, and find a way to justify that they meet again. But in my head, it just doesn't work. I'm just like, no. It's not, to me, this is where it's not the, the lightsaber handle looks different. It is essential for that scene to work that they haven't met before. And I feel like that's for me, I think that's the consistency part. It's if something happens in a prequel that takes away from the emotional weight of something that comes later that we've already seen, that's probably where it bothers me most, because I think that's where it's like you're taking away from the ethical decisions, you're taking away from the weight of it. You're making that later scene. You're telling me that my understanding of that later scene is now different than what I thought it was, and that's where that's where I really start to have a problem with it.
Well, and I think, have you ever heard the screenwriting term "save the cat"?
Yeah.
It's where you start a movie by having the character do something good. They just do something good to show that they are a good person, so they're your protagonist. They're the person to root for.
Right.
So I think in a way...
There's also a heard called kick the cat, which is that someone earlier does something bad just to show you clearly you're going to be your villain.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. I'd never heard that, but that's cool. So what I think that's showing us is this sort of ethical assessments that we're making about a character are not particular to this sort of geeky style of filmmaking or, large canons or large story. We all have this sense of like, we're watching a story, a thing happens, it informs the rest of the way we look at that character, the rest of the way we like view the story. Mm-hmm. And sometimes in toxic ways in itself, like sometimes you can have a character save the cat early on, so you're on their side, but then the rest of the movie, they're shitty. And you just kind of stay on their side. And that's not good. We should be able to assess these things. Walter White, exactly. And I don't even know that I'd say he saves the cat. Like, he doesn't even really save the cat to begin with. He has a family. Like, I don't know, spoiler alert for Breaking Bad. He has a family that he loves, I guess. Like, he has a kid with a disability. He's a teacher. Like, it all kind of gives you, he has more of like this sort of downtrodden situation. And then like when he gets cancer, you're on his side purely because,
you're sympathetic to his.
Yeah, you're sympathetic. I would never even say he's given a strong save the cat moment. There's a few throughout where he like cares about Jesse clearly. Like he feels bad about hurting Jesse. So Jesse is his cat that he's constantly trying to save, but like not enough. And like,
I think he is pretty clearly an anti-hero, or,
for sure,
Don Draper style.
Yeah. People always ask me people always ask that question. When were you out? When did you think that Walter White crossed the line? Like when he did this, when he blew up the drug dealer, when he killed the girl, when he did the thing, like whatever he did throughout the show, when did you fall out of Breaking Bad and stop rooting for him? And my answer is like, when he didn't accept the money from his friends because of pure pride, like in the first episode, like I was
That's
like,
it for me too. Yeah.
Yeah. He had an out. Like you can't feel bad you can feel bad for him, but like you shouldn't, he's not morally pure. He chose to just not get help. And that is pride. That is just pride getting in the way of you taking care of your family. And then from then on, everything that goes from that. And that's that original sin of that show.
Well, and so here's actually a great example. Let me throw this out for you. If someone were to do a Walter White prequel movie, and it's about Walter White and that friend working together, and in that movie, you discover that the friend was actually incredibly corrupt and that the money he could have offered Walter White was blood money, and that kind of explains why Walter White didn't take it and makes him look a lot more justified for not taking it. Would you feel kind of annoyed at how much that changes the moral tenor of like that scene that you'd already seen?
I would be very annoyed. That's the Han shot first, man. It's the Han shot first. Exactly. We know he's a scoundrel because he shoots the guy first. And like this, we know that he's a scoundrel, or we know that he's a prideful asshole because he was a prideful asshole in the beginning.
Yeah, and they worked so hard to show his friends in a really good, positive, like caring, charitable light. Yeah. That, you know, if they went to make a series where those guys were assholes, then like that would go completely against completely against everything that we think that they had established. Maybe they could make it work in that like they were always two-faced, and you know when a lot of people are around, they seem like they're really good people. Like
you could make it work, but you take away the emotion of that original story still. Yeah. And I think it's absolutely true.
Yeah,
I think that's a problem though with like focusing on these sorts of things. Like the problem with canon that we keep having, or the problem with canon that seems to be recurring, is when prequels are made.
Yes,
because you can't tell a story that has real stakes for the character that we already know that exists before the thing that we've seen them in already.
That's why Rogue One is probably the best prequel thus far of any of probably any of these things. It tells a great story. You even kind of know the ending if you know the Star Wars universe well, but it all new characters. They start in a different place. You have this journey of discovery with them that's brand new to you. That's what prequels work, and that's why when they started the Star Trek prequel, they set it so close to Kirk, and then they were like, it's just so hard. They keep wanting to connect it so hard, Discovery. But by the way, Discovery this year is awesome. You should all be watching it. Season 3 has been great.
Yeah, but I think it's a great example. And like, honestly, I'm now enjoying Discovery a lot more, in part because of the great reviews you guys gave it. I mean, really enjoying your Star Trek rewatches of it. I think I would like it a lot more if there's a character named Michael who maybe had some connection with some unnamed Vulcans, but had no connection whatsoever to Spock. Because now, instead of just enjoying it, every time I see their version of Spock on screen, I'm remembering, okay, but I've just watched all this stuff, original series Spock, and him talking about his interactions with humans. He never mentioned a human sister. That doesn't make sense, you know?
Right. Well, I don't mind that, but yeah.
Yeah.
He also never, just to defend that, he also never mentioned a brother, and all of Star Trek V is about his brother who's the villain of Star Trek V. So,
which, I mean,
he may just not talk about his family.
Star Trek V is such a good movie. That's its only flaw. But I do think
that's true.
It's a terrible movie, but I think it's
so
a
bad
flaw of it. Well, so let me ask this then, because I think this is something we've kind of mentioned, but I want to dive deep on. And it's kind of jumping off something you said, Matt, about how your brain is very good at finding the consistency, and that you like things that have that consistency. But I've certainly heard
my brain is very good at weaving a way for the consistency to work.
Right. Well, he's the headcanon guy.
Well, and that's my whole point, because I think a really interesting question to then talk about is when we have to use headcanon to make all the pieces fit, and now something comes along and it doesn't actually break the canon of what we were told, but it breaks the headcanon we established, and maybe a headcanon that was kind of implied. Does that bother you in the same way? Or are we able to kind of separate, like, okay, that breaks my headcanon, and maybe I can create a different way to fit these pieces together? How is that different from, like, the actual established canon?
You've already done all that work.
Yeah,
now you have to do it again.
I personally enjoy that kind of stuff. I don't mind those kinds of breaks at all. if it's because it is not canon. It's my assumptions. All headcanon is it's your assumptions that you use to make something work. Now, if they do something that destroys the only way you could think to make it work, and then you now can't, and that could be pretty annoying. I guess. I want things to work. You know, that's really all it is, man. I just want things to work. Why can't you just let them work?
We had a situation exactly like that, in fact, in Runaways, where everything was going just fine, sort of. Like, there was mention in the first episode of, like, since Obama was president, I was like, President Ellis in Iron Man 3, that happened in, like, 2013. Like, if the Runaways is happening nowish, like, there's been enough time for Obama to have come and gone and it to be somebody else. And then in one of the episodes, Chase's dad was like, you know, we've never encountered aliens before. And Matt was like, flip the table, what? He got so mad.
Don't you remember New York?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like, aliens in New York, 2012, it happened.
There are ways to take that sentence differently, honestly. Like, I'm still annoyed at it. I'm still pretty darn upset. But there are ways to take that sentence slightly differently, because they say something to the effect of extraterrestrial life. This will change all our science we've ever known, or something like that. Which technically, I think you could still headcanon. This is me doing it right now. That
here's an example, everybody.
That he means this is more extraterrestrial life, and that it could be, but it just you'd think you'd mention like, oh, extraterrestrials again. There's more, you know, something like that to the effect of, yeah, it's kind of silly.
Don't you think that though one of the Earth's most like promising inventors would have been brought in to maybe deconstruct some of the alien technology that was left on the ground when they all collapsed all at once?
Yeah, but he's kind of evil though, so I don't know.
Could help.
Wouldn't that make him more susceptible to want to do that? Like, I could advance my understanding of technology and screw over the world even better. Mwahaha.
I mean,
Star
Wars has this issue, and I'll admit it's one where I've come to really love it. But so Star Wars Rebels is, I think, actually at this point one of my top 3 or top 5 favorite Star Wars properties. It is a fantastically told story. The whole thing is a massive canon break. Jeff, you and I have talked a lot about how in A New Hope, you know, they established this idea that the Jedi have been gone for so long. Most people have forgotten about the Jedi. Most of the Imperial officers,
ancient religion.
Most of the Imperial officers like barely remember the Jedi or even know that it was a thing. And already that the Clone Wars kind of breaks that, because they remind you that you were fighting with the Jedi 20 years ago. Okay, fine. Yep. Rebels, slight spoiler, 2 of the main characters are major Jedi Force users. And it's all taking place 3 years before A New Hope. The story is so good that eventually I came to forgive it. But at first I was like, this makes no sense. And even now when I watch A New Hope, I do have a little moment of like, okay, this doesn't fit. I think I'm able to sort of say the stories are so good that I'm able to look past it. But it is definitely... I feel like it's one thing that you have to be very careful about is when, here's a funny statement, you know, the Obi-Wan says only a Sith speaks in absolutes. I think if you're ever going to be trying to create a shared universe, you have to be very careful not to speak in absolutes. Because when you say, like, this is the first time we've seen aliens, that now has to be, for the whole galaxy or the whole world, who knows about it at least, the first time you've seen aliens. You know, when they say this is the first victory against the Galactic Empire, giving us 4 years of story about victories against the Galactic Empire, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. I mean, the like, if we're going in universe within Marvel, like, the Skrulls would be fine, because the Skrulls are secret invasion. Upcoming property. Anyway, the Skrulls are a shapeshifter race. They infiltrate. So, like, it makes sense that, you know, there have been aliens on Earth, and, you know, this guy may have even dealt with some of them before because they were Skrulls as humans, but like the events of Avengers were very public.
Yeah.
Very broadcast, like had lasting, like long time lasting, long time lasting consequences and repercussions effects on the world. Mm-hmm. And for one of these things to just completely, I don't even want to say completely ignore that, but like to largely ignore that is kind of unforgivable.
I mean, on the flip side, I think it's one of the reasons why I fell in love with Daredevil as quickly as I did. Because, think about the kind of effects and re-effects and like 5-10 steps down the line that you're never going to think about because Iron Man's never going to think about this. Captain America's never going to think about this. But someone's got to rebuild those buildings. And who's going to get the construction contracts to do that? Like, to me, that was... And it's part of why I agree with you. I'm so sad that the TV shows never really got tied back into the universe. But I thought that was such a beautiful way of saying, like, yeah, our heroes won this great battle. They also wrecked all the downtown territory, all the midtown real estate. And, I mean, God, that doesn't sound like a huge problem. But you know what I mean? Like, there's repercussions. And I just love... I think this gets back to, Matt, what you were saying. It's the ethical question of... To me, even though I love it, there is something unethical, I think, about showing our heroes wreaking this incredible destruction in order to defeat the villain without ever showing us the repercussions, without ever showing us the people who had children who died in Sokovia, or the, citizens of Wakanda who die, or the people who lose their homes because of the Superman versus Zod fight, And I think, to me, that's why it becomes so important.
So would you say potentially, like, based on our understanding of character story and world canons, things happen, characters grow, things happen, the story progresses, things happen, the world changes. Would you say that it's safe to say that canon is consequences? Canon is consequences of action or inaction?
I'd say that, yeah. It's cause and effect.
Yeah. I think that's what Matt was saying. It's that, that these events, if Tony Stark flies into the heart of the alien world and almost dies, he can't be fine the next episode. He has to go through the PTSD. He doesn't have to be PTSD, but certainly...
Don't you justify Iron Man 3 to my face. Sorry. Well, my point being on this is if, canon is consequences, there are consequences to the victory. Like Cap said, the reports all say that we won. They never talk about what we lost.
Yeah.
And that has such an impact. Like, that line has such an impact now with the thought of what, the consequences of the canon are, in that the consequences to the world have to also be shown in order to tell, like, a full story, I think is what I'm getting at.
There's a wonderful series of YouTube videos called After Ever After. And they're a cappella songs, and it's a guy who is redoing Disney songs, but he's singing about what happens after the credits roll, because Disney movies don't necessarily tell you this, but I think as most people who've been in a relationship know, the fight to get to the first kiss, terrible way to say it, the journey to get to the first kiss is an important journey, but there might still be some steps in the romantic journey of conflict after that. And
you mean you don't just get married?
Yeah, you don't actually quite live happily ever after. These songs are brilliant. You should definitely check them out if you like music. They're incredibly well done, but they're also just hilariously funny and talking about those kind of problems that come up. And I feel like in the same way, I'm a political scientist. Like, that's my first education, and that's something I love. And I think one of the sort of myths of movies and TV that's just as wrong as the idea that once you have love's first kiss, everything's okay. It's once you overthrow the tyrannical government, you're going to rule and everything's going to be fine and perfect and great. And I love how The Mandalorian is exploring that. Like, no, actually, both in Hamilton, they constantly go back to this theme of, like, winning the war is easy. Governing is a lot harder. So I just love that we're seeing more of that. So that's all the good stuff about canon. What are some of the problems you think? We've mentioned a couple, but I want to go a little deeper on this. And so for me, a lot of this also came up from a great article I read in Gizmodo. I'll include the link, called "Our Fascination with Canon is Killing the Way We Value Stories." And I didn't agree with all the points, but I definitely think some interesting points were made by the author, James Whitbrook, about what are some of the downsides of being so focused on Canon. And we've mentioned them a little bit, but I'm curious, so for you all, what do you see as some of the potential problems with going so deep into Canon?
Oh, well, I mean, one of the obvious ones is that toxic fandom.
Yeah.
We see that a lot in comic book fandom, in that if this intro for this character doesn't follow exactly what happened in comics that came out 50 years ago, then, I'm going to riot, and, we shouldn't support this movie at all. And like, I admit I am one of those people at one point that was like, no, you can't do that to that character. But that was the Mandarin, and that's very important to Iron Man and his canon and story. So I take issue with the Mandarin, but but like, it's excuse me. It's like when, a movie comes out and somebody's like, well, that's not how it happened in the comics, or that's not how it happened in the book, or that's not how it happened in the last iteration of the thing. So I hate it because it's different.
Yeah.
And then you get into because of that, you get into these like great debates online of like, oh, you're not a real fan because you don't like the old way and you don't hate the new way. You can't be a real Star Trek fan unless you hate Into Darkness. Whatever.
You're a filthy casual if you've only watched the movies and haven't read the books or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, you can't be a real fan unless you've read every single Thor comic and can exactly tell me which issue in the Jason Aaron run of the Mighty Thor she finally takes her helmet off in. Like, you can't be a good fan unless you've done all these things. Like, it's bullshit. It's honestly, it's bullshit, because all of these things, like, they're telling great stories, right? Either in comics or on screen. That's why you love them so much. Why the hell are you trying to keep people out of enjoying something with you?
Yeah, I think that gatekeeping aspect can become such an important thing. And I think what you're getting there especially is that one of the things this article talks about is when the focus on canon isn't even the stuff we're talking about as much, but is that the obsession with the facts, does this happen exactly as it did in this previous version of the story? Has it been updated? And the quizzing people about it, I think can definitely be super problematic.
Yeah. I also think, yes, for sure, and all of that. And there's a fine line, because it's I care about things because there are consequences, but also I care, I want there to be good stories. And sometimes you have to have other stories told that are not going to they're not going to fit into Feige's plan.
Yeah.
And that I think leads to the other real problem with canon and the way it's being used right now. Which I love. I love the way it's being used right now, but it's the Walmartification of storytelling. It's like there's only so many dollars you can spend. And if Walmart's selling the cheapest, best thing you can get right now, you're going to spend your dollars there. So all the local shops close. Sort of the same thing's happening in storytelling, where you can only go see so many movies. You can only go... like right now we're getting ready to watch these Marvel shows and Star Wars shows that are all coming out in the coming year or two. And that is going to take up most of my brain space for story consumption, and you have to start making choices. And, Star Trek, Star Wars, Marvel, these are things I care deeply about, the things I was raised on and want to watch more of. And I'm going to have to make choices to not watch other original ideas that smaller storytellers are telling, just because I want to consume the whole universe. And there might be a show that is not the most fitting to my story needs, if that makes sense. I don't want to rail on Runaways. Well, I'll rail on one I don't mind railing on. Iron Fist. That story, season 2, I enjoyed. There were some great elements of season 2, but for the most part, that story did not add much to my life.
Right.
But I spent 20 hours watching it, and I could have spent that 20 hours really watching something valuable that really meant something to me. You know what I mean?
I'm just laughing because a million people are also just screaming like, you could also not watch something for those 20 hours. But to the three of us, that's a ridiculous concept. So
No, absolutely. But
I mean, don't understand.
You're going to have your downtime. You're going to have your shows that you watch. Probably
we're not going to
1 or 2 a day, whatever. Like if you sit down to watch a show at the end of the night, and like I was doing that only with Iron Fist for like 2 weeks because I needed to make it through Iron Fist, and that I could have spent that media consumption on something else. But yes, you're right. Clearly, you can also just not watch movies. You can do things.
I only laugh at this because I found a way to do the exact opposite. Because with superhero ethics, I'm not beholden to any particular like one universe. So
yeah,
I watch anything, and I'm like, well, this was a very good show about chess, and I guess playing chess is a kind of superpower. So sure, let's talk about it. Like, but I think you make a very good point.
You got a mate over here. You can bounce around wherever you want to.
Yeah. But I think you make a very good point. Like, I think it's fantastic that we are getting some independent stuff like The Boys or Umbrella Academy and things like that. Mm-hmm. But I think definitely The Boys, and I think weren't both of those based on pre-existing comic books?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think it's going to become a lot harder. And frankly, if there is some new TV show about a sci-fi battle against a tyrannical empire and the people have interesting pseudo-magical, pseudo-scientific powers, 10 years ago, I would have been really interested in that. Now, if we get to 2021 and that happens, there's so much Star Wars content, I might be like, well, I want to see that, but there's all this other stuff that's in the playground I already like. It's that kind of...
Yeah.
Yep.
I want to make sure I keep... I think there's a definite problem with Canon is that, if my favorite restaurant keeps adding new dishes, it's going to be hard for me to go to another restaurant. And honestly, it's part of why I like PandaVision. I think it helps push us out of that. But I think you're right.
Exactly. That's why we created that show. So the same thing you were talking about, how superhero ethics. That's why we created Bingers Assemble and PandaVision is because... I think... partially because we all three work on this stuff so much. I think we've mentioned almost every Stranded Panda podcast in this podcast, which is very funny to me. Yeah. And not even in a self-promoting way. We're just like, it all keeps coming up. But PandaVision and Bingers Assemble were created for that reason, because I love these universes. I love a tight continuity, all of that. But also, I really want to look at some other things, and I want to give myself a reason to go watch other things.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm going to be able to find time in the coming year for the next season of The Witcher. But, if we're doing it for PandaVision, then I absolutely have to, right?
Yeah, it gives you an excuse. And this podcasting, this is not related to what we're talking about, but podcasting gives us an excuse to do things we want to do. That's part of why we do it. That's why we started doing it as a hobby. It's like two things. It's like we have an excuse to watch these things and talk about them, and an excuse to hang out with a friend we enjoy and just like spend time. It's great.
And I'll admit, I
think
there's a direct connection between, and here I'm going back to a positive, and then we'll continue with the negatives. I don't think the fan podcasting world exists if the world of ongoing canon doesn't exist. Because
absolutely,
if every week we're talking about a totally new story and a totally new set of characters, then we're more kind of like being Siskel and Ebert. But like so many of the conversations you all have, it's about being able to say like, well, isn't this awesome? Like this thing that happened in this episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., it ties back to that movie we saw 4 years ago, and these great conversations we have, that makes it possible.
Yeah. Or having the conversation of like, oh my gosh, this Loki show, this character could show up, or this character, like those speculative things that can happen when you get this expansive universe and you realize there's some disparate connection that your mind draws these threads and you're like, oh my gosh, that could happen. And even if it doesn't, the excitement of having that conversation is like why we podcast practically. It's like we have so much fun with those, like, it's like, at least for me, it's one of my major reasons, just like that speculative enjoyment of like this character could be here or there or there. And still follow the rules. It could still all be within the rules.
Yeah.
Man, I'm really looking forward to what the What If series is going to do to your brain.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what it's going to do. I find myself in stories like that having a hard time caring because it feels like just an offshoot. Like it feels like it's not real.
Yeah, there's no consequences for that story because it's not canonical with the verse that we've spent 6 years talking about.
Right. At least as not as heavy a consequences. Yeah. I still want to care about stories that don't connect to the MCU or whatever, but like Sometimes that's you only have so much brain space, like I was saying. And it's not just that. It's not just what if. It's also the idea of the multiverse that they're bringing in so heavily into the MCU. I'm like, are we going to be able to talk about...
Are we sure it's not connected?
Yeah. Like, are we? Is it connected when Spider-Man could be whoever he wants to be? Like, Spider-Man could be in whichever universe he is. You know, I don't know.
I mean, to some extent, we talked about how you have to have some contrivances to make it all fit. Like, the multiverse idea is just the perfect way. Like, anything's now possible. Like, that is canon. It's just over on, Earth 22, or whatever it is.
Exactly. And the idea of having these worlds. The thing about canon for me. And this is what I always talk about this when I talk about Batman v Superman, because they brought in a Batman, and I've recently watched the director's cut, and it really fixes a lot of this for me. So I want to I'm not railing on that movie. I'm railing on the theatrically released version of Batman v Superman. I feel like they did not have Batman. I did not know who Batman was in that movie. 100%. Like, Batman is a guy who is branding people so that they get murdered in prison, and he wants to kill Superman because he assumes he's a bad guy. He has no hope that this could be a good guy. He has like, if there's a 1% chance, he deserves to die. That's not ethical. There's very little saving the cat. And I say that there is a little bit. There's the beginning of the movie. He drives his car into the battle and helps some people, but he doesn't really do much. And in the theatrical cut, they actually change all of that stuff I just mentioned about Batman is changed. They add stuff to the beginning of him running into the attack on Metropolis. They add things there. They actually add context to the branding. And it turns out it was all part of Lex's plan. Like, Lex was having people that had been killed with the brand murdered so that Superman would think worse of Batman. Right. Like, it's all part of Lex's plan, which is that all of that context helps me understand who Batman is, and that he is not intentionally getting people murdered in jail. Like, my point is, these universes, now that we've had different versions of characters, you can't, because of my love for canon, I'm not going to assume the version you're showing me. If you're showing me a different multiverse version of any character, I'm not going to assume all of the other things that I know about them are true. You have to show me those things again. Yeah. Certain facts about them you don't, but their character you do, I
think that's a great example, because I think actually you helped me make a good connection, which is I really did not like that version of Batman and Batman vs Superman. And even when I saw all that happen, I didn't, because I didn't believe that Batman could be outsmarted by Lex Luthor in that way. And when I dug deeper into that, I realized it's because the Batman that I most know and love is the Batman from Batman the Animated Series.
World's Greatest Detective, baby.
And to me, the world's greatest detective should not ever be outsmarted by Lex Luthor in that way. But the Christopher Nolan... Christian Bale Batman, maybe that one could be. And you're right, it's because it's not the MCU is one consistent universe in a way that it doesn't. But like, if Tony Stark does something in movie 4 that he would not have done in movie 1, and we don't see the growth, it doesn't make sense. But if the Robert Downey Jr. Tony Stark does something that the animated Tony Stark wouldn't have done, or the comic book Tony Stark wouldn't have done, that makes more sense. And I think that's actually a really helpful way to understand more about canon, is that I think we can easily see it as canon when it's coming from all these different versions of the story. And that we have to be a little careful about that, I
think that's one of the problems, though, that the DCEU had with Batman versus Superman, is that they were reliant on...
Yeah, they didn't reintroduce us to their version of Batman first.
Right. They were relying on global understanding of who Batman and Superman are as heroes, and that connection to the character from previous iterations, and we don't have to tell you about who this is. It's Batman, and all these things about him. But then they go completely against what, my version of Batman is that he doesn't kill. He never ever kills, because you can always put the bad guy away as long as you can beat him up and leave him writhing on the ground.
Right.
But then he's shooting guns and running through running through the backs of semi trucks, like obviously killing people, and that goes against my canonical Batman in that, you know, it's completely different from the character, but they didn't introduce this character as somebody who's okay with killing people or okay with shooting guns. Like,
you bring up an interesting point, and it's the canon, not really. So we've talked about headcanon, we've talked about canon within a universe, but now we're talking about the canon of who a character is, right? Like who that character is to you. Now crossing it into the multiverse and throw them into a different story. It's a new story. What elements of that story from the previous version are allowed to be changed? Right. And that's not headcanon. That's our own. That's like a personal canon that we have. And every fan has a different one. And it's like you with the Mandarin. You don't mind they change other things, but the Mandarin's important to you. For me, that's talking about the Snyderverse again, the DCEU. For me, Superman, the story of Superman has always been, he's a god who was made to be a god, sort of, and he's sent to this planet where he will have all this power. But then he's raised by a humble farmer, and that humble farmer gives him his morality, like instills a sense of like just like good old fashioned morality, you know,
if you ever want to
like hard work.
Why people say the Superman story is messianic? I mean, there it is, right there.
Yeah, for sure. And in the most recent version, it felt like all they were ever taught him was to hide. Yeah. And then he meets Jor-El, who tells him he needs to be a hero. And it flipped the story in such a way to me that I was like, no, this isn't my Superman. I came to terms with it, and it's not a bad story, but it was against my own personal canon of who Superman is, and it changes it too much. If we meet a Peter Parker in an alternate universe and he is just a total shithead, it'll bother me, you know? Like,
and I think this is a really good example of how so much of it has to do with, we care about the canon because the writers tell us we should care about the canon. Because, like, I'll give a good counterexample of what I think has been a fantastic example of a character that has been kept alive for decades now, almost I think more than half a century now, even though there's nothing canonical at all except for some major story beats. And it's the one Jeff offhand mentioned as the one podcast we haven't talked about much, and it's James Bond. James Bond is a character.
Breaking Bond, everyone. Breaking Bond. Check
Breaking
it
out. Bond.
Yeah. And James Bond, and I actually would love to hear their thoughts on this as well. Like, there's an established canon in terms of, like, there are certain story beats that are always supposed to happen, and there's certain character interactions that are always supposed to happen. But, you know, the canon has been changed 8 million times over the decades. And also just the tenor of it has changed. And there's actually a question I'm going to ask in a different way in a second, but just interesting to say about Bond, like, you know, when we started with the character, people thought this, like, martini drinking, sleeps with all the women, shoots all the bad guys, like, that was sexy and fun, and so that's what we saw. And then we got 30 years of that. And then we started to think, you know what, maybe that's kind of a little ridiculous. And we got more of the Timothy Dalton, Pierce Brosnan, kind of like wink in the eye, like, we're having fun with this. And then more and more people were like, no, that's not a sexy guy, that's a sociopath. And now we have Craig. Daniel. And now we have Daniel Craig playing him as a relatable but very much an anti-hero sociopath. And so, yeah, I think that's another great example of where, because there the writers never told you that we're going to try and hold a canon, you know? They never asked you to believe that. They just said, let's take this idea of a character and retell the story over and over and over again.
I think, though, they did a solid job with the first Daniel Craig one in, like, the opening scene had him dealing with this guy who was running away from him, you know, the bomb maker, and had him dealing with this guy in a way that was completely different from any other previous Bond. Because, you know, previous Bond would have been like, let's get in the car and, you know, drive all kinds of crazy, and, you know, some gadget is going to happen and it's going to, you know, wrap the guy up and, you know, then we'll catch him or whatever. But this version of Bond just, like, straight chased him down the street and, like, brutally attacked the guy in some kind of crazy hand-to-hand combat that we had never seen in Bond before. and then eventually just like shot the guy and took only the things that he needed. Like, it was a very different version of Bond, but like, because they did it in the first 15 minutes, it was like, oh, okay, this is who this guy is.
Yeah, it was a very good way of saying, like, if you're looking for more Sean Connery Bond, go back home and rent a DVD. Like, that's what this is.
Yeah, right? Go somewhere else for that.
And so that's actually a question I wanted to ask you, because I think one of the ways in which I think canon can be a problem, especially with what we were talking before about the toxicity, is when it's not just people being upset about breaking canon, especially as we move from, like, comic book to TV or to movie, but a lot of those comic books were written a long time ago. And you all talk about this a lot. You've just been recently talking about it with the Fantastic Four and X-Men. Most of those comic books were, at least a lot of them, were written at times when all of our heroes were white men. And a lot of the canon changes that unfortunately get some of the most toxic reactions is when they gender switch or race switch or make some kind of recognize that an aspect of this character that made sense in the 60s or 70s does not make sense today. I'd love to hear you guys talk about that, because I know that's something you, as two people who find canon very important, I know you've both been very supportive of times where they've made the world more diverse and have been suggesting ways of doing even more of that. So I'd love to hear kind of more of your thoughts on that in regard to canon.
Well, if we're talking, if we're going specifically into X-Men, there are, like I've said before, there are certain beats, certain things about a character that are very important to the character story. And that's that character canon. For instance, Magneto was, it's very important that Magneto is a person who was oppressed.
Right.
And, in the original canon, whatever he was, or rather in the movie, we saw that he was in a concentration camp. He was a Jew that was, assaulted during the Holocaust. Like, that is an oppressed people. But at this point in life, as time has gone on, it's very unlikely that he would still be around alive in any kind of capacity that could be menacing.
Yeah, because that's now 70 years ago. He would have to be 80 years old.
Which is why the Fox universe had to deal with this. So instead of, telling the same story over, in the new era, they kept everything in the 90s. They kept the story in the 90s because they couldn't move forward because of that one anchor point.
Right.
Right.
But like, as a flip side, Tony Stark's original story is based in the Vietnam War. And so they just made that based in the Afghanistan conflict instead.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. You shifted a bit to fit a war. That's right. Tony Stark. Boom. But then with there being like a massively oppressed people, it's a little more difficult. And that's why we've kind of shifted. Like, Magneto would make sense at this point in history if he were a black man, or really any person of color that has been or that was oppressed in the 60s, right, or the 50s and 60s. And grew up in Jim Crow America. Like, that would make sense. And that could be, that could be the source of his bitterness toward, general society.
There's also the idea that these two characters were, in part, they weren't originally conceived this way necessarily, but throughout their storytelling, they have been, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Like, that's part of the story they're telling is, one is, Professor X is Martin Luther King, and that's his ethos or whatever.
Right.
And Magneto is Malcolm X. He's by any means necessary, we will be free, And so taking that sort of directly back to where it came from, some of those stories, and telling it through two African-American men, who literally would have had possibly the same experiences, and may have even like been drawing on experiences they grew up watching those actual men. That would be fascinating to me, and I just think it draws that perfectly.
I want to counter your point and say, or women, we're still open to Whoopi Goldberg being Professor X.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right. We are.
Well, and I think there you're making. Let me try and see if I understand the point you're making, because if so, it makes total sense to me. It kind of goes back to this idea that we were saying at the beginning about how canon needs to much more be about the theme rather than the details. And so, Johnny Storm needs to be like this young, brash guy who thinks he can do anything. And if he's black, that doesn't change anything. And or whatever color
that's
he
not
is.
that's not integral to his character. That's not integral to him as a person and his heart of his story.
And in the same way, like Magneto has to be someone who has faced utter oppression and the attempted destruction of his own people, so that he now feels like taking pride in who he is and never being ashamed of it, and never trusting anyone else to protect your people except your own people. And that makes sense, whether it's, Jews in the Holocaust, or blacks in the Civil Rights Movement, or Native Americans in, the 70s, or, even with like the Dakota oil stuff or whatever it is. If we're keeping the heart of the character and the heart of the theme of the story, then changing the details either to make it more historically relevant, or to make a more diverse universe and to bring women in and bring characters of color in, or queer characters, whatever it is. That's not a canon break you cared about as much, because it's still getting to the heart and truth of the story. Is that kind of a fair statement?
That's exactly how I feel about it. And that now we're again talking about personal canon, and the problem is it's personal. So everyone has a different view of what that is.
Right.
So everyone has a different view, and for some people, now they would not call themselves racist, most of them, but for them it's important that Professor X is a white man,
a bald white man who is crippled.
Yeah, the problem is, at the time they were making these stories, that's all they could do, or like that's all they would do because of racism. So by not broadening it, it's the same thing with all racial justice. Like by not equaling things out in some ways, we are continuing the oppression of the past. Right. And since we're relying on canons that were created in the 50s and 60s, we are by not changing the races of the different characters for the modern era, we are continuing the monoculture that was created then.
Well, and that was just the one corollary to that I was going to add, which is, so I think we do have so many white heroes, and so changing Professor X or changing Johnny Storm doesn't feel like a big break to me. We don't actually have that many Jewish superheroes. And so I could see, like, as much as I love some of those ideas, I do wonder if there would be some, coming out of a Jewish perspective, who would be more upset. Like, I mean, my family's half Jewish, and I love the idea of the civil rights, Martin I love the idea of the civil rights versions of Professor X and Magneto, and I'd be all for it. But I definitely know, I can easily imagine someone being like, look, Magneto is one of our only explicitly Jewish superheroes. Don't take that away.
No, you got Mark Spector coming up.
There's always others, but I'm just saying, I think that's, I don't think there's easy answers to that question, but I think it's a very good, certainly to me, canon is problematic if we feel like we have to be locked in. If Luke Cage has to wear the blaxploitation outfit from the 70s or things like that.
I would push back a little bit because calling Magneto a hero is problematic, but like, so maybe it's like if you were like, I'm trying to think of a horrible villain, but the problem is a lot of them like, anyway, sorry.
I mean, he's a very relatable character, and who is sometimes
he is a relatable character,
more villainous and sometimes more of like an anti-hero.
Sometimes morally gray. But the thing is, it is one of the few characters, Holocaust education in media is pretty important.
Yep.
And representation of those events is important. And having the fact that Magneto, if you were to change Magneto, it is problematic because you're removing one of the few really cultural pop culture touchstones of that. And like, I get it, but it also, to maintain the character and not have him be 120, it's tricky to do that. Like you can't have him. Magneto would be very, very old if we were to maintain that and keep him crossing over with current Marvel heroes. So it's a tricky thing to do.
When that character was created in comics, like those world events had happened 20 years ago. Like, it's not that long ago in public consciousness.
Yeah.
I mean, I recently was, I've been rewatching the original series because one of my partners has never seen it before, and she was commenting on there's so many Nazis in the original series of Star Trek, because at that time, like, yeah, most of the people watching Star Trek, either they or their parents had lived through World War II and had that discernible memory. And so that was still a very common thing to be brought up. Today, it's almost never seen in the same way. I think one other interesting example that I'm curious your thoughts on, here's a character that I both wish they hadn't done part of this, but also I'm very glad they did. The Ancient One in Doctor Strange. My understanding is that character is very explicitly Tibetan, and that, I mean, this is inside baseball, and who knows the exact details, but I've certainly heard many, many versions of the story that say they, in part, couldn't make that character Tibetan because to do so would have made it such that the film couldn't be showed in mainland China, and that's a huge source of revenue for Marvel and Disney. But
yeah,
well, but
it also could kind of further the stereotype, though, of, you know, all Tibetan people are ancient mysticism type people.
Yeah, and I was going to say that I think is definitely a thing. And also they made the character a woman, which is itself another great change. And so, yeah, I thought that was a really interesting way of handling that, of we can't go in this one particular direction, but we're going to try and go in a very different one.
And this is not what our discussion is about today, but like, yeah, representation is hard to work out. Yeah. Because every change you make is changing someone else's story that they love, you know, and every way that you change a character, and like clearly I agree that a lot of these changes are great and fine and wonderful, but it's just like you were talking about with Magneto. I had not considered that, the changing of a Jewish character removes that. I still would go for it in this case, but like I understand completely why that's problematic.
Right.
It's tough, man. It's a tough.
We need more Jewish heroes, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, is you just have to make sure you're telling a mix of stories, which is why I bring up that Walmartification idea, like, of storytelling. You gotta keep new stories coming in, new blood coming in, and that's the one good thing Marvel and Disney are doing. They are bringing in creators of varying backgrounds and histories and you know, faiths and everything, which is great. But you still have this Disney overlord monoculture that like is kind of suppressive, you know?
Yeah. No, I think it's very true, and I think that there's still all these ideas of like what the general public will watch, what the public in different areas will watch, you know, in terms of like gender and things like that. And I think we're breaking a lot of that down, but it's still there. I also think in a way that
sure.
can be also a positive of this greatly expanded canon, which is that, you know, if you only have 3 heroes and all of them are white, that's a huge problem. But if you have 30 heroes, then now it's much easier to have like all sorts of different perspectives represented among that 30. Without a feeling like that this one character has to be, you know, check all the boxes or whatever the kind of, you know, dumb ideas about what representation should look like falls into. My point being like the boxes should be checked, but that it shouldn't just be let's check the boxes so that people don't bother us. It should be real representation, the kind you're talking about, where like they bring in writers, they bring in directors and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which they're very much doing for Miss Marvel, which kind of like makes me proud. Like, go Disney.
Yeah.
You know, good job bringing in like all these people who fit the culture that you're trying to tell the story of. Like, if you brought in a bunch of white people to try to tell Pakistani American culture, like, you're failing.
Yeah. And I think that's becoming a lot more common. You know, like Frozen 2, they had quite a lot of the indigenous people of Scandinavia were very involved in telling that story. There was some other story recently that involved Native American folks, where they had gotten a lot of folks involved that now I can't remember the details of. Very outside of our genres and not Native United States. Anne with an E. That TV show, they worked a lot with folks from the native populations to show that part of the story. And that's a great example of it. We're very much outside our normal genre. But do you all know anything about Anne of Green Gables and then the most recent TV show, Anne with an E?
No.
So it's a wonderful set of novels that was beloved by people, especially young women, but all people for generations. I think they were written in like 1910 or something like that. And they're about a young, plucky Canadian girl finding her way as an orphan in Prince Edward Island in turn of the century Canada. And, you know, the story is told in great ways, but is written in that that time and place and has a lot of the biases and prejudices of that time and place. This new show, Anne with an E, that came out a few years ago, very, very good, and it has black characters, and it has Native American characters, and it changes the way the original characters relate to those in ways that are like, okay, this doesn't fit the original book, and maybe it doesn't even fit the actual historical understanding of the time, but it's just so much better. So yeah.
You know, it's interesting to say all that. I want representation. I want representation at all levels, but I long for a world where we have enough representation that it's not problematic for anyone to tell any kind of story, still with proper reverence and proper, like, for instance, recently we had Watchmen, and he knew it. Damon Lindelof told that story. He's a white man telling this very black story, and he got a lot of black writers to work with him, but he was the one with in this situation, it was a power dynamic thing. But I think his writing sensibilities were perfect for that show and did a wonderful job telling that story, again, with proper representation in the room. But still, the guy leading the show was a white guy telling this very black story. And I think that, like, I don't think that we have to. I'd love to see a world where representation is so ubiquitous that it stops being so problematic for people of various. To no matter what you are, you can tell a different kind of story in all kinds of ways, whether it goes one way or the other. Right. Problem is we don't live in that world, and so I fully am I want us all to strive for more representation, but I want good stories from good creators to be able to be told, no matter who they are.
Well, and I think one thing, cause I remember being very surprised, honestly, when I heard that the writer of Watchmen was white, because I'd read so much, particularly from black journalists and reviewers, being very, in praise of that show. And digging deeper, as you said, he's the one person writing it, but I think he was very conscious of saying, like, I don't know that I truly understand the meaning of Tulsa. So I'm going to consult with a lot of, black historians and other leaders and other writers to make sure I'm writing that perspective honestly. And I think that's one of, a lot of the fiction world now, especially in like YA and fantasy and sci-fi fiction, there's now becoming this culture of having like, people who read a draft who are not from your cultural background, just to kind of like point out the things that maybe you missed or the things that like maybe you weren't thinking about. And I think that, we're moving more and more to that kind of world where you're right. Anyone in a great world, anyone should be able to write the story that they feel like they can write.
You need to have consulting representation.
Yeah, or just an idea of like...
at least, at a minimum.
Well, just the idea of when you're trying to write someone else's story, that you're making sure that you're not writing your version of their story, but you're trying to understand their version of their story.
I think that's a great way to put it. I really do.
Yeah. And it's funny that that you say it that way, in that, we have unconscious biases, we have unconscious things that we do that are potentially oppressive. We recently got comments in the Strain and Panda Facebook chat where I apparently had made a bunch of robot jokes about Vision when we were talking about the WandaVision trailer. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't even realize I was doing it. I don't even remember that I did it. Am I robophobic?
We need to get Jacob Alichich, the most recent regular co-host of this show, back on, because his Twitter name is Bots Are People Too. And he has a very strong, pro-droid life attitude. But yeah,
he's just sucking up to our future overlords.
Yeah, I for one welcome our new robot overlords.
Hey, listen, my stepfather came on this show just to defend the robots in the Matrix. So I'm trying to keep on that right side. So I want us to start wrapping up, and let me just kind of throw this out. We've mentioned them as examples, but just kind of go deeper. What are some examples for each of you about either really good examples or you think times where it really didn't work in terms of how canon was treated?
I've said Iron Man 3.
That's a break
for your personal canon,
the comic universe and the show. I more mean something where internal to its own universe, where it felt like there was a canon break.
For canon break. Okay, sorry. I was thinking of sort of a lack of consistency in the rules.
Yeah, I mean,
but that's not really what you're talking. Well, I was thinking of Punisher, but which is not really the same thing. A lack of sort of ethical consistency. Punisher season 2, where he fires. I guess it's a break in canon. It's not really. It should be. He fires into a blank wall. He thinks he's killed 2 women. So he goes through an episode where he is horribly sad that he has broken his own rules and killed 2 innocents. And then the next episode, he realizes he didn't actually kill those 2 women. It was his enemy tricking him into thinking he'd killed those 2 women. And so the next episode, he fires through a wall to get his other enemy. And I was just like, what are you doing? Yeah. Why is his character not remembering that don't fire into walls blindly? Like, that is so dumb.
Yeah, I think that counts.
Clearly, I can't hit innocent people.
He didn't learn his lesson. Yeah. He didn't feel any of the repercussions of this event that could well have been horribly traumatic.
So it's not exactly a canon break, but it's not respecting what has gone on before, not having him learn. I think that character is smart enough to have learned a lesson there, and he did not.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been a problem if he had not been so broken down over it. Like if he had just been from the beginning, like, nope, that wasn't me. That couldn't have been me. I don't know how to prove it, but I don't do those sorts of things.
Because if you had been a totally different kind of sociopath.
Yeah, right. Like if it had been anything other than, oh God, I did this bad thing, then it kind of would have been okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like the growth just went away because he no longer had a reason to worry anymore.
And I feel like, Jeff, you actually put your finger on something we hadn't even talked about, but I think is a great kind of summation of a lot of this. For me, what Canon does is not just that it shows the repercussions, but it shows that the writer understands the repercussions of what already happened. Because I think that's what really bothers me. I felt like in that case, the writer didn't understand that the repercussions should be about you just don't fire into the room to begin with, you know? And that's why I want to see, like, yeah, flying a nuclear bomb into an alien, like, invasion. Like, there are going to be repercussions about that. And it's part of where canon breaks really bother me is when it feels like the writers don't understand the repercussions that would happen.
Yep. One of my examples of great canon that I absolutely love is that in Spider-Man: Homecoming, in the very beginning, we got this example of the cleanup crew before damage control came in and took over. And for years since 2012 when Avengers happened, I had never thought about the fact that like somebody has to clean up all this crap. Somebody has to clean up after Tony Stark. And the fact that he kind of created his own department, the Department of Damage Control, like to try to help the relief effort after the fact, it just makes so much sense that like, of course that's what he would do if he's this, this character who has turned to trying to do these good, these philanthropic and charitable acts and be a good person now. Like, of course that's what he would do. But then, there again, he still craps on small people who were already doing that job because he just assumes that somebody's not already doing that job.
Yeah. I think it's a good example.
And then we get to see how that over time has kind of caused these people to go a little off the rails, maybe a little dark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I think that all was very fair. I think for me, both my best and my worst example of canon comes both from Star Wars. And in terms of the worst, it's frankly, it's what Jeff and I talked about extensively on the Star Wars Universe cast in terms of our reviews of the prequel movies. And it's that the original 3 Star Wars movies really set up this world in which the Jedi had mostly died out. And they told us this sort of like ways in which all these subtle things happened. And it just felt to me like the prequels with midichlorians and with the way that Anakin was treated, but especially just the idea that all this was happening 20 years ago, it was not in any way true to that part of the story. And to me, that felt like it wasn't just like a historical date getting wrong. It made the later movies not make sense in a lot of ways. And I've confirmed this actually now I have a number of friends who saw the prequels first And then later were asking me when they saw the next set of movies, we're like, wait, this doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. It's like, well, yeah, because they did it wrong. And I think the best example of keeping canon that I've seen recently is, and the MCU, I'll say, has done so many good ones, but in a recent episode of Mandalorian, spoilers, skip ahead a little bit if you haven't seen the most recent episodes of Mandalorian, though if you have missed this spoiler, I'm greatly impressed by you. But the character of Ahsoka Tano...
We're on episode...
What we're saying?
We got one more... Oh, sorry. I was just making sure which episode. This most recent one?
Oh, no. This is from like 2 episodes ago.
Okay. Then we're good.
Yeah.
Just seeing if I need to take my headphones off. Sorry.
No, you're good. But the character of Ahsoka Tano returns. And in that character, we see so much of her character. We learn so much about her. One thing that had been well established in the canon from, many years ago, 30 years ago in terms of her story, maybe 5 or 10 years ago in terms of when it was made, Clone Wars and then Rebels, is that she has this very deep reason for distrusting the Jedi and for having concerns and fears about what can happen when a good person turns bad. And I thought that what they did with her character was so perfect because, and it actually addresses a problem with canon that we didn't get to discuss, but I'll mention briefly here. They did it in a way that the people who loved that original canon caught the Easter eggs that they dropped. And it was like, this character feels 100% in the same arc of the character we met before. She made an offhand reference to something that was clearly about Anakin. She talked about the Jedi. Like, it all felt real. And it felt to me like such a good way of honoring the character who I'd loved from this other show many years ago. But at the same time, they did it in a way that the people who had never seen any of those things still fell in love with the character too and still got her. And I think that was the one last problem with canon that I forgot to mention, but I wanted to bring up is I think the problem of gatekeeping by fans can be really bad. I also think I think there's a real problem when you have sort of gatekeeping by the writers, where it's this story is only going to make sense to you if you've seen all those past things. And to some extent, that's fine. Like Infinity War, yeah, you've seen some other Avenger movies, that makes sense. But I've definitely seen movies where it feels like if you haven't watched like all 30 episodes or read 5 books, this doesn't make any sense to you. And I thought that was a huge danger with Ahsoka Tano, and I really thought they nailed it of paying off the canon for those who knew it, but not in a way that alienated the people who didn't.
I agree.
I agree completely with that. Although it's a weird balance because people who did not watch the other 22 movies did not get Endgame the same way that we get Endgame, and it's like we would love them to go even deeper sometimes, and that's what I'm hoping these television shows do that they're planning. But like it's like this weird thing where I watched a Star Trek episode 2 weeks ago, from 2 weeks ago, the most recent episode of Discovery, and it was so steeped in prior lore that I was watching it with Alyssa, and she was not getting it. She was like, "What?" Yeah. I kept having to pause it to explain things, but I was like beaming because of all of the deep continuity they were sprinkling in. Mm-hmm. And I kept having to be like, oh, this is because of in the original series that happened. And then I hit play. I'm like, okay, this is because in the Next Generation that happened. And then hit pause. Oh, this is because 2 seasons ago on Discovery she did this. And it just like all this stuff that tied together so well and so interestingly. They even tied it to Picard, which was like mind blowing because they this one episode referenced like every Star Trek series practically. And I was just like, I was loving it because they were paying homage to guys like me who have been watching this stuff forever, but it loses someone else. Yeah. And so there's always going to be this sort of attenuator where you have to be able to like decide how much you want to rely on previous canon. How much does your story not only like respect original canon, that's one level, but relying on it does make a guy like me like beam. I was crying during that episode because of the deep continuity, which is like a weird experience because it was just so well done and well crafted. And it was like in cool story and character ways, they were crafting these stories together. But to someone who's never seen all those other stories, it didn't mean near as much. And it's a weird balance to strike for sure. Yeah.
Somebody whose first movie is Avengers Endgame, in the Marvel continuity. Like, they're doing it wrong, first off.
Yeah.
But if that's their first movie and I'm sitting there just weeping throughout the entirety of the film, they're going to be looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Right. I don't understand.
Yeah, I think that's so well put. And I mean, one thing I'll say is, like, I hope even stuff like Discovery is accessible for everyone. But I feel like I have a very different bar of how accessible a particular episode of a TV show should be versus, like, the big tent pole, this should make the most money of any movie for the whole year kind of movie.
Right.
But actually, so, and maybe this is kind of a good closing question to end on. The whole time the Netflix Defenders TV shows were on, I kept being frustrated that we never saw those characters on film. You know, that we had legal wranglings about heroes, but Charlie Cox never appeared to defend anyone. That, you know, Jessica Jones or Luke Cage never got involved in any of these fights or anything. The more I think about it, the more I think, especially after seeing the Ahsoka stuff, I'm now starting to wonder, and maybe it was a throwaway line or two, it wouldn't matter, but it makes me wonder if maybe it's better that those characters didn't appear in the movies, because there'd be no way to do it in a way that still made sense to the people who had just seen the movies and not seen the TV shows. And I know that's a topic you all talked about a lot back then, so I'm kind of curious for your sense, like, in terms of that kind of attenuation that you're just talking about, Matt, where would putting those Netflix TV characters into the Marvel movies fall for you?
Oh, it just depends on how you do it.
Yeah.
I think you could absolutely do it. You would just have to, you have to be mindful of both audiences, which is very, very hard to do, but people do it all the time. They do it all the time just to introduce a character. They introduced Black Panther in Civil War. You didn't have to know anything about him, but they introduced him. He fights, he shows up, and you realize he is Black Panther. And you could have the same thing. You could just have a lawyer show up to defend Peter Parker, and they still might do this in Spider-Man 3. You could have a lawyer shows up to defend Peter Parker. He's helping out. He's just a blind lawyer. Doesn't matter. He's just a nice character that you get to know, and you don't ever have to show him as Daredevil, and all the Daredevil fans would love it.
Yeah.
And they could have some lines that, like, connect with vigilantism, and it could, like, really mean a lot to those of us who've watched it before. But, like, no, you know, like, the regular audience could just be like, oh, whatever. I don't know what this means.
We have a shining example of this kind of thing in Endgame, in that Edwin Jarvis from the Agent Carter series showed up. Like, that actor showed up in Endgame as Jarvis. And anybody who hadn't seen Agent Carter doesn't give a shit. Yeah. Like, he says, thank you, Jarvis, or whatever he says to Jarvis. He specifically mentions him by name. And, like, people who had only seen the movies are like, oh, that must be who Tony based the Jarvis AI on. And, like, that's fine. That's enough for them. But then for us, these, like, crazy rabid fans, we saw that guy on screen. We knew him from Agent Carter, and we were like, oh my God, it's all canon! Yes! I'm
going to say something that I have probably never said before, and I'll maybe have a few other things like this in the future, but probably not many. I'm going to say something in praise of The Rise of Skywalker, the last of the Star Wars movies. Which is that there's the scene where Rey is kind of, like, feeling like all of the Jedi for all time coming into her and, like, giving her strength. And
gross.
Sorry. This is not Panda After Dark. This is the mature superhero ethics. We're not mature at all.
Yep. That's not what we do here.
And I think for most fans, what they heard was a number of different voices all saying, like, you know, you can do this. Most of whom were probably not very recognizable, but it didn't matter. It was all voices of Jedi. If you were a really deep fan of the Clone Wars and Rebels, you heard a number of those voices, including the voice of the woman who played the animated Ahsoka Tano. And to me, it's that same thing. Like, it's still a good scene either way. It doesn't fit the rest of the story in any way, shape, or form, but that's a whole other thing. But it's a powerful scene. But I think so much more powerful for those. And yeah, I think that's another great example of how you can bring in canon in a way that doesn't alienate people. And that's what you really have to be careful of. And not go like the Discovery route that you're talking about, where I don't think it's a problem because it's like one episode of a TV show. But I think if you have a tentpole movie like that, where people just don't understand it, then you have more of a problem.
Well, you have more of a problem. I don't know that you have more of a problem from a storytelling perspective, but you have more of a problem from a money perspective. Like if they do that, they're just not going to make the money that they need to make that happen. You don't make your money on how good the story is, unfortunately, or how deep the story is. So it's in their best interest to, like work well with that, I don't know. No. Sorry, I'm kind of meandering.
Yeah, we've been going for a while, so we can start wrapping up. We've gone for, wow, there's going to be a hell to edit, but a great conversation nonetheless. Any other kind of last closing comments either you want to make, something we didn't get, a question you wanted to raise, or something we didn't get to discuss in terms of the good and bad of continuity?
I don't think so. I think I'm good. I think we have exhausted, and honestly, this was a really great conversation. Like, we came up with not only examples, but we really kind of shaped 3 different brands of continuity and what they mean, and they're really, or canon, I should say. And that really is, that was interesting. Thanks. Good. Thanks for this.
Yeah. It was a fun thought experiment. I had not delved into it in this kind of analytical fashion before.
Well, cool. Yeah. I'm really glad to hear that, because that's exactly the kind of I love the fact that you and a lot of the other podcasts, including what I do with Star Wars, really get to deep dive on some of these things. And I think what I try to do on this podcast, is do a little bit more of the wide angle lens and say kind of like, okay, this thing from Star Wars, how does that connect to this thing from Marvel and DC or James Bond or whatever it is? So thank you both so much for coming on this. When I had this idea, you two were the exact ones I wanted, and this was a great conversation. So as we wrap up, as I mentioned, you two have maybe been doing 1 or 2 things on the rest of the Stranded Panda podcast network. What are you all up to at MCUCast?
Oh man, so much. We're up to so much. They just did these big announcements for the Marvel Cinematic Universe that we are going to be covering, and it's looking like we're going to get almost an episode or a movie every week next year, and it's looking like all really high quality stuff with these Disney Plus shows featuring the actual actors from the shows. And yeah, we're just very, very excited over there. So we've been doing mostly trailer breakdowns, which I'm really excited. The Stranded Panda YouTube channel, we've been dropping these trailer breakdowns where we're going frame by frame through the trailer and actually zooming in when we need to see certain things and like enhancing it and enhance.
Specifically focusing on breasts for Matt.
Yeah. Just zooming in on, it was funny. There was actually a lot of stuff to talk about with the different brooches and necklaces people were wearing in the WandaVision trailer. And so I kept zooming in on necklaces, but it looked like I was zooming in on everyone's breasts. And so we had a good time talking about breasts.
Had a good chuckle.
But no, it was a really, really, really fun conversation. And just to live kind of like really try to explore the trailer in like a whole way where we're looking at every frame at a time. It was fun. Really fun.
Yeah, we made some astounding discoveries in focusing on jewelry.
Yeah, we did. One particular was really cool.
Honestly, we talked about all the problems with Canon, and I do think there's some real problems, but I feel like what you did with those episodes is the absolute best of what fandom, especially fandom connected to Canon, can be, because when I watched those, the news about the new stuff, I was going absolutely bonkers. And my partners like this stuff. The partner I live with, she's interested in it, but she doesn't share that joy with me. And just getting to listen to you go so deep on it and to be just so excited about all this new stuff, I felt like I wasn't alone with it. And to me, that's the whole point of Stranded Panda. I'll say on the Star Wars Universe cast, we did the same thing. We put up a podcast, an episode all about the new Star Wars content coming out that I hope people get the same feeling about being super excited about. And I just think this is such an amazing time to be a fan. I'm just so glad we're doing all this stuff on Stranded Panda. I'll give a couple quick shout outs as well. All of us have done various things on the PandaVision podcast, which is all about shows that don't have their own universe, but are still great. Ashley Coffin and I are literally, as soon as I finish this episode, I'm going to go watch the first episode of The Stand, the new TV show that's come out. And then on Sunday, Ashley and I are going to record on that. Hopefully I'll have it up Monday or Tuesday. So we're going to have some really great times talking about that show. Hopefully it's going to be good. We already talked about the 1994 miniseries, how it was really bad, but a lot of fun to watch. So yeah, all over. And there's the Breaking Bond podcast we've talked about. Matt and Dave doing great things in the Star Trek Universe podcast. We heard recently that they have started reshooting the Orville, so Matt and I will get to do our stuff about that. So much good content coming. Definitely check out everything going on at strandedpanda.com. If you want to ask more questions specifically about this, we're on Facebook and Twitter, Superhero Ethics. The best way, though, is just to go to the Stranded Panda Facebook group. We have great discussions there. Or just find us on the website, strandedpanda.com. You can learn about all the different things there. But if you click on Superhero Ethics, you'll find our email, our Facebook, all the ways to contact us. So, Matt and Jeff, thank you so much. Thank you to our fans for listening. Have a great day.
Until next time, true believers.